Have you ever looked at the news and felt a chill run down your spine? The world feels fragile, like it could break at any moment. Tensions simmer between nations. Disputes flare up like sudden storms. What if one of these conflicts, seemingly small and contained, suddenly exploded? What if a local flare-up became a global inferno? These are not idle thoughts. They are the questions that keep world leaders awake at night. And they should concern us all. The truth is, we live in an interconnected world, a world where the ripple of a butterfly's wings in one corner can cause a tsunami on the other side of the globe. What happens in the South China Sea, for instance, doesn't stay in the South China Sea. It affects us all. This is the story of one such potential flashpoint, a story of fishing boats and water cannons, of angry words and military alliances. It's a story that could have been ripped from tomorrow's headlines, a story that asks a chilling question. What happens when a local conflict explodes onto the world stage? The South China Sea shimmers under a tropical sun, a source of life and beauty. But beneath the surface, tensions are rising. China claims almost the entire sea as its own, ignoring international laws. This claim puts them on a collision course with their neighbors, including the Philippines. Filipino fishermen who have fished these waters for generations now face a stark choice: abandon their livelihoods or risk the wrath of the Chinese Coast Guard. These are not just theoretical threats. Chinese ships, often heavily armed, regularly harass and intimidate Filipino fishermen. They fire water cannons, ram fishing boats, and even make arrests. The situation is a powder keg. One spark could ignite a major international incident, and that spark may have already arrived. In recent weeks, tensions have escalated dramatically. The Chinese Coast Guard has become increasingly aggressive, leading to a dangerous game of brinkmanship. The situation has not gone unnoticed in Manila. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the president of the Philippines, has issued a stark warning to Beijing. Any harm to Filipino fishermen, he vowed, will be met with a swift and decisive response. And he hasn't ruled out invoking the country's defense treaties, potentially dragging the United States and other allies into a conflict with China. The incident that sparked the latest crisis was as simple as it was dangerous. A group of Filipino fishing boats were going about their business in the Spratly Islands. These islands, claimed by both the Philippines and China, have long been a flashpoint. But on this day, the tension was palpable. The fishermen, seasoned veterans of these troubled waters, could sense it in the air. As the fishermen cast their nets, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel emerged from the horizon. It was a behemoth, dwarfing the small Filipino boats. The Chinese ship blared warnings over its loudspeaker, ordering the fishermen to leave the area. The fishermen, though fearful, stood their ground. They had as much right to be there as the Chinese, they argued. The standoff lasted for hours. The sun beat down on the tense scene. The fishermen, anxious but resolute, continued their work as best they could under the watchful eyes of the Chinese crew. Then, without warning, the Chinese ship fired. Powerful jets of water slammed into the Filipino boats, tossing them around like toys. The fishermen, caught off guard, clung on for dear life. Some were thrown into the churning sea. It was a chaotic and terrifying scene, a stark reminder of the imbalance of power in these waters. News of the incident spread like wildfire through the Philippines. Images of the water cannon assault, captured on shaky cell phone footage, played on loop on television screens. Public outrage was immediate and intense. Protests erupted in the streets of Manila, with people demanding a strong response from their government. President Marcos Jr., facing the first major foreign policy crisis of his presidency, knew he had to tread carefully. China, after all, was a global superpower, a giant on the world stage. The Philippines, in comparison, was a small nation with limited military capabilities. But Marcos Jr. also knew that he couldn't afford to appear weak. The incident in the Spratly Islands was not an isolated one. It was the latest in a long line of provocations by the Chinese. And if the Philippines didn't take a stand now, what message would that send? In a televised address to the nation, President Marcos Jr. was firm and resolute. He condemned the Chinese actions in the strongest possible terms. He called the water cannon attack a cowardly act and a violation of international law, and he vowed that the Philippines would not be intimidated. "Let this be a warning to all who seek to violate our sovereignty and harm our people," Marcos Jr. declared, his voice echoing with quiet anger. "We will not hesitate to defend our rights. We will not back down." Section 3, a treaty's teeth. President Marcos Jr.'s warning did not come out of nowhere. The Philippines, though militarily outmatched by China, was not without allies. In fact, the Southeast Asian nation had a powerful friend in its corner, the United States. The two countries, bound by history and shared strategic interests, were parties to the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. This treaty, a relic of the Cold War, obligated the United States to come to the Philippines' aid in the event of an armed attack. The treaty was not just a piece of paper. It was a solemn pledge, backed by the might of the United States military. And while the treaty's language was open to interpretation, did it cover an attack on Filipino fishermen, for instance? There was no doubt that the United States took its commitment seriously. President Marcos Jr., in his address to the nation, made it clear that he was prepared to invoke the treaty if necessary. He ordered his defense minister to explore all options to ensure the safety of Filipino fishermen. And he reached out to his American counterparts, seeking assurances of support. The world watched with bated breath. Would this be the moment when a local conflict in the South China Sea spiraled into a major international crisis? Would the United States, bound by its treaty obligations, be dragged into a confrontation with China? The Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States wasn't the Philippines' only ace in the hole. Manila had been busy in recent years strengthening its ties with other countries wary of China's growing assertiveness. Japan, Australia, even India all had a stake in keeping the South China Sea open and free. These partnerships, while not formal military alliances like the US treaty, carried significant weight. Japan, a maritime power in its own right, had its own territorial disputes with China in the East China Sea. Australia, a staunch US ally, was increasingly worried about China's ambitions in the Pacific. And India, facing off against China along its Himalayan border, understood the importance of standing up to Beijing's bullying tactics. The Philippines, once seen as a vulnerable pawn in the great game of geopolitics, was suddenly emerging as a linchpin of regional security. Its location, strategically positioned at the heart of the South China Sea, gave it an outsized importance, and its willingness to stand up to China, however small it might be in comparison, had earned it the respect of other countries in the region. President Marcos Jr., a shrewd political operator, understood the power of these alliances. He knew that the Philippines couldn't take on China alone, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. The world was watching, and many countries had a vested interest in seeing China's expansionism checked. In Washington, President Biden and his national security team huddled in the Situation Room, their faces grim. The situation in the South China Sea was deteriorating rapidly, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. A misstep, a miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. The United States had a long and complicated history with China. Economic ties bound the two superpowers together, yet strategic rivalry pushed them apart. The South China Sea, a vital shipping lane and a potential flashpoint for conflict, was at the heart of this delicate balancing act. President Biden, a seasoned statesman with decades of foreign policy experience, knew he had to tread carefully. The United States had a moral obligation to support its treaty ally, the Philippines. But he also had to weigh the risks of a direct confrontation with China, a nuclear-armed power with global ambitions. The Pentagon, eager to demonstrate American resolve, urged a show of force. Deploying warships to the South China Sea, they argued, would send a clear message to Beijing that the United States would not tolerate any aggression against its allies. But diplomats at the State Department cautioned against escalating the situation. Diplomacy, they argued, however difficult, was the only way to prevent the crisis from spiraling out of control. In Beijing, the mood was a mixture of defiance and anger. Chinese officials, long accustomed to getting their way, were furious at the Philippines' audacity. How dare this small, insignificant nation challenge the might of China? The state-run media, a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party, launched into a predictable tirade of nationalist rhetoric. The Philippines, they claimed, was a puppet of the United States, a pawn in a cynical game to contain China's rise. The incident with the water cannons, they insisted, was a minor issue, blown out of proportion by Western propaganda. Behind the bluster, however, there were signs of unease. China's economy, though still formidable, was facing headwinds. The COVID-19 pandemic, followed by a global economic slowdown, had taken its toll. The last thing Beijing needed was a military conflict that could disrupt trade and further damage its international standing. Yet, backing down was not an option for the Chinese leadership. To do so would be seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation for other countries to challenge China's claims in the region. The stakes were high, and the pressure was on to find a way out of the crisis without losing face. Across the globe, from the bustling streets of Manila to the corridors of power in Washington, a sense of dread settled in. The drums of war, though distant, were beating louder. The world held its breath, bracing for what might come next. Military analysts, their maps and charts spread out before them, gamed out various scenarios. A naval blockade of the Philippines, airstrikes against Chinese military installations, a full-scale invasion. Every possibility, no matter how remote, had to be considered. The economic consequences of a conflict were just as daunting. The South China Sea was a vital artery of global trade, and a disruption to shipping lanes would send shockwaves through the global economy. Oil prices would skyrocket, supply chains would be disrupted. The world, already grappling with economic uncertainty, would be plunged into chaos. And then there was the human cost. War, however it might be fought, would inevitably result in loss of life. Filipino soldiers defending their homeland, Chinese troops following orders, innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. The thought was unbearable, yet impossible to ignore. The world was at a crossroads. One path led to dialogue, diplomacy, and a peaceful resolution. The other led to conflict, destruction, and unimaginable suffering. The choice, as stark as it was simple, rested in the hands of a few powerful individuals. Don't miss out on future explorations and discoveries. Hit subscribe and ring the bell to stay updated with our new content. Your journey of wonder continues with every video. Stay connected and engaged on social media. Continue the conversation, follow us. Thank you for being a part of the Have You Ever Wondered community. Keep wondering, keep discovering. Until next time.